The chatter of silverware against fine china filled the air at the ivory room, as Jasmine moved between tables with practiced grace. This wasn't just any Thursday night. The restaurant was packed with the city's elite, their expensive watches catching the light from crystal chandeliers overhead. For 5 years now, she had balanced trays and memorized complicated orders at this high-end establishment, where a single meal cost more than what she made in a day. Table 7 needs their check, and 9 just ordered another bottle of the Cabernet, said Miguel, one of the other servers, as he rushed past with a tray of desserts. Jasmine nodded, tucking a loose strand of curly black hair behind her ear. Her feet ached in the mandatory black heels the restaurant required female staff to wear, but she never let the pain show on her face. Tonight was the kind of busy that meant good tips, and good tips meant she could finally fix the leaky pipe in her apartment bathroom. At the center of the restaurant stood a gleaming black grand piano. Most nights it was played by Thomas, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair who knew every jazz standard by heart. But Thomas had called in sick and the piano sat silent, its polished surface reflecting the warm lighting of the dining room. "You're on tables 12 through 15 tonight," said Robert, the floor manager, as he appeared beside her with his ever-present clipboard. 12 is a big one, some tech company celebrating a product launch or something. The reservation is under Wells. Jasmine felt her shoulders tense. The large parties were always a gamble. Sometimes they tipped generously, caught up in their celebration. Other times they ran her ragged and left barely enough to cover her bus fare home. "Got it," she said, straightening her black vest and checking that her bow tie was centered properly. She made her way to table 12, a semi-private area near the back of the restaurant with a perfect view of both the piano and the small waterfall feature along the west wall. 8 people were already seated, their conversation a rumble of deep voices punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. As Jasmine approached, she immediately spotted him, Alexander Wells. His face was plastered across tech magazines and business journals. Last year, his company had developed some revolutionary software that Jasmine didn't quite understand, but it had apparently made him billions overnight. He sat at the head of the table, his expensive suit jacket draped casually over the back of his chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal a watch that probably cost more than her yearly rent. "Good evening," she said, her professional smile firmly in place. "Welcome to the Ivory Room. My name is Jasmine, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with some drinks?" Wells looked up at her, his gaze lingering a beat too long before a smile spread across his face. "The woman of the hour," he said, his voice carrying that distinct confidence of someone used to being listened to. "We're celebrating tonight. Bring us your best champagne. 3 bottles. One of the men at the table, wearing glasses with thick black frames, leaned forward. "Alex, that's excessive even for you." Wells waved him off. "Ben, we just closed a deal worth 9 figures. I think we can splurge a little." He turned back to Jasmine. "And some of those little fancy appetizers too, you know, the ones with the caviar." "Of course, sir. I'll have those out for you right away," Jasmine replied, jotting down the order on her notepad. As she walked away, she could feel eyes on her back. The kitchen was a flurry of activity, chefs calling out orders as line cooks moved with choreographed precision. 3 bottles of Dom Perignon for table 12, she told Dwayne. The sommelier. He raised an eyebrow. "The Wells party? Figures. That guy spends money like it's going out of style." He reached for the wine key. "I'll bring these out myself. Chef wants to know if they're ready to order food yet." "Just drinks and appetizers for now," Jasmine said, placing the order for caviar canapes with the kitchen before heading to check on her other tables. The night flowed on, a rhythm of orders taken, food delivered and empty plates cleared away. The Wells party grew louder with each empty bottle, their laughter more boisterous. By the time Jasmine brought their main courses, 2 more people had joined them. Squeezing in around the table that was already set for 10, Wells held court like a king, telling stories that had his companions hanging on every word. He ordered expensive dishes only to take 2 bites before pushing them aside. When Jasmine came to clear the plates, he barely acknowledged her, continuing his tale about some mishap on his recent yacht trip. "You should have seen the captain's face," Wells was saying as Jasmine carefully reached between 2 guests to collect a barely touched plate of truffle risotto. "He thought we were going to crash right into—" The abrupt silence made Jasmine look up. Wells was staring at her, but not at her face. His eyes were fixed on her hands as she balanced the stack of plates. "Those are pianist's fingers," he said suddenly. Jasmine froze, caught off guard by the personal observation. "Excuse me?" "Your fingers," Wells repeated, gesturing with his wine glass. "Long, slender. My mother was a piano teacher. I'd recognize pianists' hands anywhere." He turned to his companions. "Wouldn't you agree, Ben? Look at her hands." Ben adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable with being put on the spot. "I wouldn't know, Alex." Jasmine felt heat rise in her cheeks as everyone at the table turned to look at her hands. She resisted the urge to hide them behind her back. "I should get these to the kitchen," she said, trying to move past the awkward moment. Wait, Wells said, reaching out as if to stop her, though he didn't actually touch her. "Do you play? The piano?" The question hung in the air. Around them, the restaurant continued its dinner service, but at table 12, all attention was on Jasmine and her answer. She considered lying. It would be easier to say no and walk away, but something in her couldn't bring herself to deny that part of herself. "I used to," she said simply. Wells's eyes lit up. "I knew it. I'm never wrong about these things." He glanced toward the silent piano in the center of the room, then back to Jasmine. "Where's the usual guy? The one who plays here?" "Thomas is sick tonight," Jasmine replied, shifting the weight of the plates in her arms. A slow smile spread across Wells's face, the kind that made Jasmine's stomach tighten with unease. She'd seen that look before, from people who thought her job made her their personal entertainment. So the piano's just sitting there, all lonely, Wells mused, swirling the remaining champagne in his glass. He looked around at his friends, several of whom were already smirking in anticipation of whatever was coming next. "Seems like a waste." Jasmine took a small step back. "I should really get back to play something for us," Wells interrupted, his request sounding more like a command. The table fell silent. Even the two men who had been engaged in their own side conversation stopped to look up. "I'm working, sir," Jasmine said quietly. "I'll make it worth your while," Wells continued as if he hadn't heard her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a money clip, peeling off several $100 bills. $500 to play one song." One of the women at the table, who had been mostly quiet all evening, touched Wells's arm. "Alex, stop. You're embarrassing her." But Wells was on a roll now, energized by his own idea. "No, Carol, I'm serious. I want to hear her play." He raised the stack of bills. "Make it 1,000. Robert, the floor manager, appeared beside Jasmine as if summoned by the commotion. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his eyes darting between Jasmine and the money in Wells's hand. "Everything's fine," Wells assured him. "I'm just trying to convince your waitress to give us a little musical interlude. The piano's just sitting there unused." Robert looked uncertainly at Jasmine, then at the influential customer whose tab would likely exceed several $1,000s tonight. She could almost see him calculating the risks, offending a billionaire versus breaking restaurant protocol. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate while Ms. Carter is on duty," Robert began cautiously. "I'll pay her," Wells insisted. "And I'll add a generous tip to the bill for the restaurant's flexibility." He turned his attention back to Jasmine. "What do you say? One song, $1,000 cash. Easiest money you'll ever make." The offer hung in the air between them. $1,000 would cover her rent for the month, with enough left over to finally get her piano at home tuned properly. It had been sitting slightly flat for over a year now. Around them, other diners had begun to notice the exchange. Curious glances were thrown their way, conversations quieting as people sensed something interesting unfolding. Jasmine looked at the piano, its silent keys calling to her in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Then she looked back at Wells, whose expression had changed from amusement to genuine curiosity. "You don't think I can play, do you?" she asked quietly, finally setting the stack of plates down on an empty side table. Wells leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I think anyone can press keys," he said. "But can you actually play? That's what I'm paying to find out." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about proving something. To him, to everyone watching, and maybe, Jasmine realized, to herself. Robert cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter, if you feel comfortable, I suppose we could make an exception. Just this once." Jasmine looked around the restaurant. Nearly every table was full, and many faces had turned in their direction. The regular buzz of conversation had dimmed to a curious murmur. Even some of the kitchen staff had paused in the doorway, wondering what was happening. In that moment, standing there with all eyes on her, Jasmine felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the familiar flutter of pre-performance nerves, a sensation she had once lived for before life had forced her to put her dreams aside. She looked back at Wells, who was watching her with an expression somewhere between amusement and challenge. Whatever he expected, whether it was awkward fumbling or mediocre playing, he was about to be very surprised. "Song," she agreed finally. Wells grinned triumphantly and slapped the stack of bills on the table. "The floor is yours." Jasmine walked toward the piano, aware of every eye in the restaurant following her movement. The black and white keys seemed to call to her from across the room, both familiar and frightening at the same time. How long had it been since she'd played for an audience? Not since that final recital at Juilliard, before everything fell apart. Her shoes clicked against the hardwood floor as conversations hushed around her. A path cleared as she approached the grand piano that dominated the center of the ivory room. Its polished surface reflected the overhead lights, making it gleam like a dark mirror. Jasmine ran her fingertips lightly over the closed lid, feeling the cool, smooth wood beneath her skin. Back at table 12, Wells was grinning, leaning over to whisper something to the man beside him. They both chuckled, and Jasmine felt a flash of determination rise within her. She knew what they expected, an amateur performance, something to laugh about later over more expensive champagne. "Remember that waitress who thought she could play?" they'd say. Robert, the floor manager, hovered nearby, his expression caught between worry and curiosity. "Ms. Carter, you don't have to do this," he said quietly, for her ears only. "It's fine," Jasmine replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I've got this." She sat down on the bench, adjusting it slightly to accommodate her height. The keys lay before her, pristine and waiting. Jasmine placed her hands in her lap for a moment, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. Then, with deliberate care, she lifted the fallboard that covered the keys. Someone coughed in the silence. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere to her right. Jasmine blocked it all out, focusing only on the instrument before her. She flexed her fingers, stretched them wide, then brought them to rest lightly on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. What should she play? Something simple and safe, or no? If she was going to do this, she would do it properly. She would show Alexander Wells exactly what a waitress with pianist's fingers could do. Jasmine began to play the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The piece started gently, almost questioning, the notes falling like soft raindrops into the hushed restaurant. Her fingers remembered the way, muscle memory taking over as she sank into the music. The initial shock of hearing actual music coming from her hands quickly faded from the faces watching her. Surprise gave way to something else, attention, real attention. Even the kitchen staff had paused in their work. Standing in the doorway to listen, Jasmine felt herself relax into the piece, letting the music flow through her as it built from its delicate beginning toward something more complex. Her hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence, finding the rhythms and emotions embedded in Chopin's composition. The restaurant around her seemed to fade away, leaving only herself and the piano. At table 12, Wells had stopped smiling. His champagne glass sat forgotten in front of him as he leaned forward, eyes fixed on Jasmine's hands as they danced across the keyboard. The piece grew more intense, the notes coming faster now, building toward the dramatic middle section. Jasmine's fingers flew over the keys, drawing out the passionate melody that had once been as familiar to her as breathing. The music filled every corner of the ivory room, bouncing off the high ceiling and wrapping around the stunned diners. No one ate, no one spoke. Even the bartenders had stopped mixing drinks to listen. As the piece reached its most technically challenging section, Jasmine leaned into it, her body swaying slightly with the music. This was the part that had always given her trouble during her conservatory days. The passage her old professor had made her practice for hours. But tonight her fingers found every note perfectly, the music pouring out of her as if the past 5 years had never happened. In the kitchen, Chef Paolo stood in the doorway, a spoon still in his hand, his mouth slightly open in astonishment. 2 tables over from Wells, an elderly couple held hands across their table, the woman's eyes glistening with tears as she listened. Jasmine was lost in the music now, remembering why she had once loved performing so much. Each note was a word in a language she had almost forgotten she could speak. The restaurant, the diners, Wells and his $1,000, all of it faded to the background as she played. As she approached the final section of the piece, Jasmine opened her eyes briefly and caught a glimpse of the room around her. Everyone was motionless, watching her with expressions ranging from shock to wonder. At his table, Wells sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. The final notes of the ballad rang out, lingering in the air before fading to silence. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The quiet was absolute, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath. Then the applause began. It started with one person, then another, and suddenly the entire restaurant erupted in thunderous clapping. People rose to their feet, their faces alight with the joy of unexpected beauty. Jasmine remained seated at the piano, her hands now resting in her lap, her heart racing. She hadn't performed like that in years, hadn't allowed herself to feel the rush of sharing music with an audience. She'd forgotten how it felt, like flying, like freedom. Chef Paolo was applauding wildly, calling out, "Brava! Brava!" from the kitchen doorway. Robert stood nearby, clapping with an expression of astonished pride on his face, as if he'd somehow been responsible for discovering her talent. At table 12, Wells was on his feet with the others, his face transformed. Gone was the smug amusement, replaced by something that looked remarkably like humility. He caught Jasmine's eye across the room and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, almost an apology. As the applause continued, an older woman approached the piano. She wore an elegant blue dress and carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to attention. "My dear," she said, her voice just loud enough for Jasmine to hear over the continuing applause. "That was extraordinary. I'm Eleanor Blackwood. I serve on the board of the City Symphony Orchestra." She pressed a business card into Jasmine's hand. "Call me tomorrow. We should talk." Before Jasmine could respond, Eleanor moved away, returning to her table where she resumed her seat with graceful dignity. The applause finally began to die down, and Jasmine rose from the piano bench on slightly shaky legs. She smoothed down her uniform and took a small instinctive bow before stepping away from the piano. As she walked back toward Wells' table, the restaurant burst into another round of applause. Diners reached out as she passed, touching her arm or shoulder, murmuring words of praise and astonishment. "That was Chopin's Ballad No. 1, wasn't it?" asked an older gentleman as she passed his table. "Beautifully played, just beautiful." Jasmine nodded her thanks, unused to such attention after years of being practically invisible in her waitress uniform. When she reached table 12, Wells was still standing. His friends looked up at her with new eyes, seeing her properly for perhaps the first time all evening. "That was—" Wells began, then seemed to struggle for words, possibly for the first time in his life. "That was not what I expected." "No," Jasmine replied simply. "I don't think it was." Wells picked up the stack of bills he'd placed on the table earlier and held it out to her. Then, after a moment's consideration, he reached back into his pocket and added several more $100 notes to the stack. "You've earned this," he said, his voice more subdued than before. "And I owe you an apology." Jasmine looked at the money. This morning she would have jumped at it, thinking of the rent and the leaky pipe and the untuned piano in her apartment. But something had shifted inside her during those minutes at the piano. "Keep your money, Mr. Wells," she said quietly. His eyebrows shot up in surprise. "What? I didn't play for the money," Jasmine explained. "I played because you didn't think I could." A murmur went through his companions, and Wells stood there, money still extended, looking genuinely confused. It was clearly not a familiar feeling for him. "At least take something for the performance," he insisted. "Name your price." Jasmine considered this for a moment. "Donate it," she finally said, "to the city's music education program for underprivileged kids. They had their funding cut last year." Wells studied her face, a new kind of respect dawning in his eyes. "Done," he said, tucking the money back into his pocket. "But I'd like to hear you play again. Perhaps under different circumstances." Before Jasmine could respond, Robert appeared at her side. "Ms. Carter, if you're finished here, may I speak with you for a moment?" Wells nodded, releasing her from the conversation. "We'll talk later," he said, his tone making it clear it wasn't a request. Jasmine followed Robert toward the back office, aware of the eyes that continued to follow her. As they walked, staff members smiled at her, the same people who had barely noticed her presence for years. "Jasmine," Robert said once they were in the relative privacy of the hallway leading to his office. "Why didn't you ever tell us you could play like that?" She shrugged, suddenly feeling exhausted as the adrenaline of the performance began to fade. "You never asked." Robert shook his head in disbelief. "The owner is on the phone. He wants to speak with you." "Am I in trouble?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Trouble?" Robert laughed. "Quite the opposite. I think your life just changed." Jasmine glanced back toward the dining room, where patrons were still talking excitedly, some looking in her direction. At table 12, Wells was deep in conversation with his companions, gesturing toward the piano. Perhaps Robert was right. Perhaps everything had just changed. But as she followed him toward his office, one thought kept running through her mind. She had just played Chopin in front of a room full of people, and it had felt like coming home. Robert opened the door to the small office at the back of the restaurant. Unlike the elegant dining area, this space was purely functional. Filing cabinets against one wall, a desk cluttered with schedules and invoices, and a single window that looked out onto the alley behind the ivory room. "He's online too," Robert said, gesturing to the phone on the desk. "Just press the blinking button." Jasmine nodded, her heart still racing from the performance and the unexpected attention. As Robert closed the door behind him, she took a deep breath and picked up the receiver. "Hello? This is Jasmine Carter," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Miss Carter." The booming voice of Gerald Phillips, owner of the ivory room, filled her ear. "What's this I'm hearing about you playing Chopin in my restaurant? Robert says the whole place gave you a standing ovation." Jasmine shifted uncomfortably. In the 5 years she'd worked at the ivory room, she'd only met Mr. Phillips a handful of times. He was usually too busy with his network of high-end restaurants to visit often. "I'm sorry if it was inappropriate, sir," she began. "Inappropriate?" Phillips laughed. "My dear, Robert says we've had 3 tables ask if you'll be playing again tomorrow night. One of them was the mayor's wife." Jasmine blinked in surprise. "Oh, why didn't you tell us you were a pianist? And not just any pianist. Robert says you played like a concert performer." She sank into the chair behind the desk. It never came up." "Well, it's come up now," Phillips declared. "Listen, Thomas has been talking about cutting back his hours anyway. How would you feel about playing for us a few nights a week? We'd adjust your schedule, of course, and there would be a considerable increase in your pay." Jasmine's mind raced. To play again regularly in front of an audience. The thought sent both excitement and anxiety coursing through her. I'd need to think about it," she said finally. Of course," Phillips agreed. "Take the weekend." "But Jasmine, this could be a wonderful opportunity for both of us." After ending the call, Jasmine sat in the quiet office for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. In the span of 20 minutes, her carefully constructed life had been turned upside down. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Robert poked his head in. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded, standing up. "Mr. Phillips offered me a position as a pianist." Robert grinned. "I figured he might. He's always looking for ways to bring more customers in." He hesitated. "What did you tell him?" "That I need time to think," she replied. "Fair enough." He glanced at his watch. "Look, why don't you take the rest of the night off? Lily can cover your tables. But Wells's party, don't worry about them," Robert said with a wave of his hand. "After that performance, I doubt they'll be giving us any trouble. Besides, the guy at table 6 is a reporter for the Tribune. He's been asking questions about you, and I think it's best if you're not on the floor right now." Jasmine felt a flutter of alarm. "A reporter? What kind of questions?" "Nothing bad," Robert assured her. "Just wanted to know your name, your background." I didn't tell him anything, of course. Relief washed over her. The last thing she needed was her name in the papers. Her past, the reason she'd left music behind, was still too painful to become public knowledge. "Thanks, Robert. I think I will head out if that's okay." 20 minutes later, Jasmine stepped out of the employee entrance into the cool night air. She'd changed out of her uniform into jeans and a simple blue sweater, her curly hair freed from its tight bun and falling around her shoulders. The alley behind the restaurant was quiet. Just the distant sounds of traffic and the hum of the kitchen exhaust fans breaking the silence. She dug in her bag for her bus pass, eager to get home and process the events of the evening. Maybe she'd even play her own piano tonight, something she rarely allowed herself to do anymore. Ms. Carter. The voice made her jump. Alexander Wells stood a few feet away, leaning against the brick wall of the building. He'd put his jacket back on, and in the dim light of the alley, he looked less imposing than he had in the restaurant. Mr. Wells, she acknowledged, clutching her bag a little tighter. Can I help you with something? He pushed himself off the wall and took a step toward her. I wanted to apologize properly. What I did in there, it was rude and condescending. Jasmine nodded but remained silent, waiting. I've been called out by my friends for being a jerk, he continued with a self-deprecating smile. Carol threatened to quit if I didn't come and make this right. There's nothing to make right, Jasmine replied. You paid for a performance and I gave you one. Wells shook his head. We both know that's not what happened. I tried to embarrass you and instead you showed everyone in that room what true talent looks like. He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Where did you learn to play like that? Jasmine hesitated. She didn't owe this man her life story. Juilliard, she finally said, deciding the simple truth was easiest. I studied there for 4 years. Wells's eyebrows shot up. Juilliard? And now you're waiting tables? There was no judgment in his tone, just genuine confusion. But Jasmine felt a flash of defensiveness anyway. Life happens, she said shortly. Sometimes plans change. A sleek black car pulled up at the end of the alley, its headlights momentarily blinding them both. That's my ride, Wells said. Can I offer you a lift somewhere? No thanks, Jasmine replied. I take the bus. At this hour? Wells frowned. At least let me call you a car service. I've been taking the late bus for 5 years, Mr. Wells. I'll be fine. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. All right, but take this. He held out a business card. I meant what I said about wanting to hear you play again. My foundation hosts several charity events each year, and we're always looking for exceptional musicians. Jasmine took the card reluctantly, tucking it into her pocket without looking at it. I'll think about it, she said, though she had no intention of calling. Wells nodded, seeming to sense her hesitation. That's all I ask. He turned to go, then paused. Oh, and I've already arranged the donation to the music program. I doubled it. Before Jasmine could respond, he was walking toward the waiting car. She watched as he slid into the back seat and the vehicle pulled away, its taillights disappearing around the corner. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. As Jasmine walked, her mind replayed the evening's events on an endless loop. The feel of the piano keys beneath her fingers, the absolute silence of the restaurant as she played, the thunderous applause that followed. The bus was nearly empty when it arrived. Just an elderly woman with shopping bags and a young man nodding off in the back. Jasmine took a seat near the middle, leaning her head against the cool window as the city passed by outside. What would her life have been like if she'd never had to leave Juilliard? If her parents hadn't died in that car crash during her senior year, leaving her responsible for her 3 younger siblings? If she hadn't had to abandon her scholarship, her dreams of concert halls and international tours, to work 2 jobs while raising teenagers? The memory of her final recital came back to her, the last time she'd performed publicly before tonight. She'd played the same Chopin piece, knowing it would be the last time she'd touch those keys as a student. The next day, she'd packed up her dorm room and returned home to become the head of her fractured family. The bus turned onto her street, a row of modest apartment buildings in a neighborhood far removed from the upscale district where the Ivory Room stood. Jasmine pulled the cord for her stop and gathered her things. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building that had seen better days. The elevator was perpetually out of order, so she climbed the stairs slowly, her body suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the long day and emotional evening. Inside her small 1-bedroom apartment, she locked the door behind her and kicked off her shoes. The space was neat but worn, secondhand furniture, faded curtains, walls that needed a fresh coat of paint. But in the corner of the living room stood her most prized possession, an upright piano that had belonged to her grandmother. Jasmine set her bag down and walked over to it, running her fingers lightly over the wooden top. Unlike the gleaming grand at the restaurant, this instrument showed its age. A scratch along one side, keys that had yellowed slightly over the decades, a bench with a worn cushion. But it was hers, the one piece of her former life she'd refused to give up, even in the hardest times. She sat down and lifted the cover, revealing the familiar black and white keys. For a moment she just looked at them, remembering how it had felt tonight to play without restraint, to let the music flow through her again after keeping it bottled up for so long. Slowly, she began to play, not Chopin this time, but a simple melody her mother had taught her when she was just a child. The notes filled her small apartment, wrapping around her like an old friend's embrace. As the final notes faded, she heard her phone buzz from inside her bag. Reluctantly, she closed the piano and retrieved the phone. The screen showed a text from her sister Zoe, who had recently started college on a full scholarship. "How was work tonight? Boring as usual?" Jasmine smiled, her fingers hovering over the keys. How could she possibly explain what had happened? How a billionaire's attempt to mock her had instead reopened a door she'd thought permanently closed. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she typed back. 3 dots appeared immediately. "Try me." Jasmine took a deep breath. Where should she even begin? Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Zoe. An unknown number flashed on the screen, followed by a text. "This is Eleanor Blackwood. We met briefly tonight at the Ivory Room. I know it's late, but I couldn't wait to reach out. The symphony has a special performance next weekend and our pianist has fallen ill. After hearing you tonight, I know you'd be perfect. Please call me as soon as you can. This could be the fresh start you deserve." Jasmine stared at the message, her heart pounding in her chest. A fresh start. Was that even possible after all this time? She glanced at her piano, then back at the phone. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where music was at the center again, not just a painful reminder of what she'd lost. With trembling fingers, she saved Eleanor's number to her contacts. Morning light filtered through Jasmine's thin curtains, waking her earlier than she would have liked after a night of restless sleep. She'd tossed and turned for hours, her mind replaying the events at the Ivory Room like a movie she couldn't pause. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, half expecting to find that she'd dreamed the whole thing. But no. There was the text from Eleanor Blackwood and 3 more messages that had come in overnight. One from Robert. "Half the staff is talking about your performance. The other half is mad they missed it. Take the weekend off paid. We'll talk Monday." Another from her sister Zoe. "You still haven't told me what happened. Call me." And the third from an unknown number. "Ms. Carter, this is Ben Harris, Alexander Wells's assistant. Mr. Wells would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. Please call this number." Jasmine set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. What had started as an ordinary Thursday night shift had somehow turned her quiet life upside down. Part of her wanted to pull the covers back over her head and hide until everything returned to normal. But another, a part she'd kept buried for years, felt awake and alive for the first time in a long time. She got up and made coffee, carrying the steaming mug to her piano. The morning sun hit the worn wood, highlighting the scratches and watermarks that told the story of its journey. This piano had been in her family's living room when she was growing up. It had moved with her to her first apartment after Juilliard, then to the cramped house she'd shared with her siblings after her parents died, and finally here. She set her coffee down and played a simple scale, letting the familiar pattern center her thoughts. What was she going to do about all these new opportunities suddenly being thrust at her? Playing part-time at the Ivory Room would mean a steadier income than waiting tables, doing something she loved. But Eleanor Blackwood's offer to perform with the symphony, that was something else entirely. That was stepping back into the world she'd left behind, a world that might not be as welcoming as it once was to someone who had disappeared from it for 5 years. And then there was Wells. What did he want? Another performance, he'd said. But people like him always wanted something more. Her phone rang, startling her. It was Zoe. "Finally," her sister exclaimed when Jasmine answered. "I've been dying to know what happened. Your text was so mysterious." Jasmine smiled despite herself. At 19, Zoe still had the enthusiasm of a child sometimes, despite everything she'd been through. "It's complicated," Jasmine began. "The best stories always are," Zoe replied. "Spill it, sis." So Jasmine told her everything. The Billionaire's challenge, the performance, the applause, the offers that had followed. There was a long silence when she finished. "Zoe, are you still there?" "I'm here," her sister said, her voice thick with emotion. Jazz, this is amazing. It's what you deserve. It's what you've always deserved." Jasmine felt tears prick at her eyes. "It's been so long. I don't know if I can do it." "Of course you can," Zoe insisted. You never stopped being talented just because you stopped performing. You just put it on hold for a while. 5 years is more than a while, Jasmine pointed out. For what it's worth, Zoe said softly, I think Mom and Dad would want you to do this. They were so proud of you, Jazz. They wouldn't have wanted you to give everything up for us. The mention of their parents sent a pang through Jasmine's chest. I didn't have a choice. Back then, no, Zoe agreed. But now, me and the twins are good. I'm in college, they're about to graduate high school. You've done your part, Jazz. Maybe it's time to do something for yourself. After they hung up, Jasmine sat at her kitchen table, turning her phone over and over in her hands. Zoe was right. Her siblings were older now, finding their own paths. The responsibility that had fallen so heavily on her shoulders at 22 had lightened over the years. Maybe it was time. With a deep breath, she dialed Eleanor Blackwood's number. The older woman answered on the second ring. Eleanor Blackwood speaking. Ms. Blackwood, this is Jasmine Carter from the Ivory Room last night. Ms. Carter, I'm so glad you called. Eleanor's voice warmed immediately. I was hoping to hear from you today. You mentioned something about the symphony needing a pianist? Jasmine said, trying to keep her voice steady. Yes, for our spring showcase next Saturday. Anton Petrovich was scheduled to perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, but he's come down with pneumonia. We're in quite a bind. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. Rachmaninoff's second concerto was notoriously difficult, with its complex rhythms and technical demands. She'd performed it once during her third year at Juilliard, but that was ages ago. I'm not sure I would be the right fit, she began hesitantly. Nonsense, Eleanor interrupted. After what I heard last night, I have complete confidence in your abilities, and we don't need an answer this minute. Why don't you come to the Symphony Hall tomorrow morning? You can meet Maestro Rivera and try the piano. Then you can decide. It was a reasonable request, and Jasmine found herself agreeing before she could overthink it. Wonderful. Eleanor sounded genuinely pleased. Shall we say 10 o'clock? I'll meet you at the stage door. After ending the call, Jasmine felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. The symphony. It was the kind of opportunity she'd dreamed of in her student days. Her phone buzzed with a text reminder about the call from Wells's assistant. That she could deal with later. Right now, she needed to see if she could still play Rachmaninoff. She spent the next 4 hours at her piano, working through the first movement of the concerto from memory. Her fingers stumbled at first, finding the complex patterns rusty but not forgotten. By early afternoon, she was playing more confidently, the music coming back to her like an old friend. She was so absorbed that she almost didn't hear the knock at her door. Frowning, she checked the time, nearly 3 p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Jasmine closed the piano and went to the door, peering through the peephole. A man in an expensive suit stood outside, looking slightly uncomfortable in the dingy hallway of her apartment building. Yes? She called through the door. Ms. Carter? I'm Ben Harris, Alexander Wells's personal assistant. We spoke earlier. Well, I left a message. Jasmine hesitated, then unlocked the door but kept the chain on, opening it just enough to see him properly. Ben Harris was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with glasses and a friendly face that seemed at odds with his formal attire. How did you find my address? She asked. He had the grace to look embarrassed. Mr. Wells has resources. I apologize for the intrusion, but he was quite insistent about speaking with you. And he couldn't call like a normal person? Ben smiled slightly. Mr. Wells isn't what most people would call normal. He sent me to personally invite you to his home this evening. He's hosting a small gathering and would be honored if you would attend, and perhaps play for his guests. Jasmine's first instinct was to refuse. She had no desire to be paraded in front of Wells's rich friends like some curiosity. I'm busy, she said flatly. Ben nodded, unsurprised. He thought you might say that. He asked me to tell you that several influential people in the music world will be there, including Richard Davenport from Meridian Records and Victoria Chen, the director of the International Piano Competition. That gave Jasmine pause. Those were serious names in the classical music industry. Why would he do that? She asked suspiciously. Mr. Wells was affected by your performance last night, Ben said carefully. He feels he misjudged you and wants to make amends by introducing you to people who might appreciate your talent. Out of the goodness of his heart? Jasmine raised an eyebrow. Ben chuckled. Mr. Wells doesn't do anything without multiple reasons, but in this case I believe he genuinely wants to help. And yes, probably show off to his friends that he discovered you, but he shrugged. The connections could still be valuable. Jasmine considered this. It felt too much like charity, but on the other hand, 5 years working at the Ivory Room had taught her that networking was everything in this city. What time is this gathering? She asked finally. 7 o'clock. I can send a car for you at 6:30. She thought about Eleanor Blackwood and the symphony opportunity. About Zoe's encouragement. About 5 years of putting her dreams on hold. I'll need the address, she said. I'll get there on my own. Ben looked like he wanted to argue, but nodded instead. As you wish. He handed her a cream-colored envelope. The details are in here, along with a pass for the security gate. After he left, Jasmine opened the envelope. Inside was an elegantly printed invitation to an evening of music and conversation at Wells's address, a penthouse in one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. She set it on her kitchen counter and went back to her piano. If she was going to play for music industry executives tonight, she needed to be ready. At 6 o'clock, Jasmine stood in front of her closet, facing a dilemma she hadn't anticipated. What did one wear to a billionaire's penthouse? Her wardrobe consisted mainly of practical, everyday clothes with one black dress she kept for special occasions. It was simple but elegant, a knee-length sheath with cap sleeves that she'd worn to her brother's high school award ceremony last year. It would have to do. She took extra care with her appearance, letting her natural curls frame her face instead of pulling them back as she usually did for work. A touch of makeup, her mother's pearl earrings, and her one pair of decent heels completed the look. As she locked her apartment door, Jasmine felt a flutter of nerves. She was stepping into a world she'd glimpsed only from the edges, serving drinks and taking orders from people who moved through life with the ease of privilege and wealth. But then she reminded herself that in another world, the world of music she'd once belonged to, she had earned her place through talent and hard work. Tonight, she wouldn't be a waitress entering a billionaire's domain. She would be Jasmine Carter, pianist, returning to the path she'd once walked. The taxi dropped her off at the gleaming high-rise overlooking the park. A uniformed doorman checked her invitation and directed her to a private elevator that would take her directly to the penthouse. As the elevator rose smoothly upward, Jasmine took deep, steadying breaths. Whatever happened tonight, she decided, would be on her terms. She wasn't going to let Alexander Wells or anyone else decide her worth again. The elevator doors opened onto a foyer of gleaming marble. Beyond, she could see a spacious living area where perhaps 30 people mingled, their quiet conversations punctuated by occasional laughter. And in the center of the room stood a magnificent grand piano, even more impressive than the one at the Ivory Room. A server in a black uniform approached with a tray of champagne glasses. Welcome, Ms. Carter. Mr. Wells has been expecting you. Jasmine declined the offered champagne with a polite smile. She needed a clear head tonight. The server nodded and moved away, leaving her to take in the scene before her. Wells's penthouse was exactly what she'd expected, and nothing like it at the same time. The space was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city lights below. Modern artwork hung on the walls, pieces she recognized from her art history classes at Juilliard. The furniture was sleek and minimal, allowing the view to be the true centerpiece of the room. But there was warmth here, too. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with well-worn volumes rather than decorative leather bounds. A chess set sat on a side table, a game apparently in progress. Fresh flowers brightened every corner. It felt less like a showplace and more like someone actually lived here. Jasmine spotted several people she recognized: a famous conductor, a renowned violin virtuoso, the dean of the music department at the city university. The guests were dressed elegantly but not flashily, engaged in animated conversations that she could tell were about music, even without hearing the words. This wasn't the kind of shallow society gathering she'd expected. This was a serious musical salon. Ms. Carter, you came. She turned to find Alexander Wells approaching, dressed more casually than he had been at the restaurant, in dark slacks and a simple navy sweater that somehow probably cost more than her monthly rent. I was curious, she admitted. He smiled, and for the first time, Jasmine noticed that his eyes crinkled at the corners when he did so. It made him look more human than he had at the ivory room. "Curiosity is a good start," he said. "Come, let me introduce you to some people." Over the next hour, Wells guided her through the room, making thoughtful introductions that emphasized her Juilliard background and her talent, never once mentioning that he'd first heard her play as a waitress. These weren't superficial exchanges. Each introduction led to genuine conversations about music, composers, techniques. Richard Davenport from Meridian Records spent 15 minutes discussing his theory on modern interpretations of Romantic-era compositions. Victoria Chen asked intelligent questions about Jasmine's training and influences. A music professor from the university engaged her in a friendly debate about Chopin versus Liszt. It struck Jasmine that no one was treating her like an oddity or a charity case. They were treating her like a peer who belonged in this room. As she was speaking with a composer whose work she'd studied in school, she noticed Wells slip away toward the piano. He nodded to the server, who gently tapped a spoon against a crystal glass. The room quieted. "Friends?" Wells said, his voice carrying easily across the space. "Thank you all for coming tonight. As promised, I have a special musical treat for you." Jasmine tensed. Was this the moment when she became the evening's entertainment? When she'd be asked to perform like some novelty act? "I'm delighted to welcome Thomas Green to my home," Wells continued, gesturing toward a distinguished older man Jasmine hadn't noticed before. For those who don't know, Thomas is the head of the City Symphony's youth program, and he's brought two of his most promising students to play for us tonight. Jasmine exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. She wasn't the entertainment after all. Two teenagers, a boy and a girl, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, stepped forward. They were dressed in their best clothes, their faces a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The boy carried a violin case. "Lily and David have been with our program for 3 years, Thomas explained. They're both from our outreach initiative in the East Side schools that sadly have seen their arts funding cut dramatically in recent years." Jasmine watched as the young musicians prepared to play, the girl seating herself at the piano while the boy unpacked his violin. They exchanged a nervous glance before beginning a beautifully synchronized rendition of a Beethoven sonata. Their talent was evident, but so was their lack of access to regular instruction. The girl's technique was good but inconsistent, showing gaps in her training. The boy played with passion but struggled with some of the more technical passages. Still, there was something profoundly moving about their performance, the raw potential, the genuine love of the music that shone through every note. When they finished, the applause was warm and genuine. Thomas beamed with pride as his students took modest bows. "Wonderful, wonderful," Wells said, stepping forward again. "And this, friends, is why I've invited you all here tonight. As Thomas mentioned, music programs across our city are facing severe budget cuts. The Symphony's youth outreach program, which has produced remarkable talents like Lily and David, is in danger of being eliminated entirely," murmurs of concern rippled through the room. "That's why I'm announcing tonight that the Wells Foundation will be establishing a $5 million endowment for music education in our city's underserved schools." Applause broke out, along with exclamations of surprise and approval. "But," Wells continued, raising a hand, "this is just the beginning. I'm challenging everyone in this room to join me. Whether you can contribute financially, offer your time as a mentor, provide performance opportunities, or donate instruments, every one of us has something to give." As he spoke, Jasmine saw the businessman she'd met at the ivory room transform into something else entirely. Someone passionate, committed, articulate. The cynicism she'd expected was nowhere to be found. "And now," Wells said, his voice softening, "I have one more surprise for you all. Last night I had the privilege of hearing one of the most extraordinary pianists I've encountered in years." Jasmine felt her heart skip a beat as Wells's eyes found her in the crowd. Jasmine Carter studied at Juilliard before circumstances forced her to put her career on hold. Her performance of Chopin last night left everyone who heard it speechless. "Jasmine, would you honor us by playing something tonight?" All eyes turned to her. This was the moment she'd been prepared for, yet now that it was here, she hesitated. This wasn't about being put on display anymore. Somehow in the last 24 hours, everything had shifted. Jasmine made her way to the piano as the young musicians gathered their things and stepped aside, the girl giving her an encouraging smile. As she sat down on the bench, adjusting it slightly, Jasmine looked out at the room full of influential people in the music world. A week ago, even a day ago, she would have given anything for an opportunity like this. Now it had arrived in the most unexpected way. She placed her fingers on the keys, considering what to play. Chopin again? Something more technically impressive to show her range. But as she looked around the room, her eyes landed on Lily and David, the young musicians who reminded her so much of herself at their age. Talented, passionate, in need of guidance and opportunity. Instead of a classical piece, Jasmine began to play a simple, haunting melody her father had taught her, a traditional song passed down through generations of her family. The notes filled the room, telling a story of loss, perseverance, and ultimately, hope. From this core melody she began to improvise, weaving in elements of classical structure she'd learned at Juilliard with the soulful essence of her father's music. It was nothing she'd ever played in public before, not the carefully rehearsed performances of her student days or the technical showpieces meant to impress competition judges. This was Jasmine Carter, her whole self translated into music. When the final notes faded away, there was that moment of profound silence she remembered from the ivory room, the space between the end of the music and the return to reality. Then slowly the applause began, building until it filled the room. Victoria Chen was the first to approach her. "That was extraordinary, Ms. Carter. I've never heard anything quite like it. Would you consider entering the international competition this fall? With that level of technical skill and emotional expression, you could go very far." Before Jasmine could answer, Richard Davenport joined them. "Forget competitions, Victoria. She needs to record. That fusion of classical technique with traditional elements, there's a whole album there. Maybe a series." Thomas Green touched her arm gently. "My students could learn so much from you, Ms. Carter. Have you ever considered teaching?" Overwhelmed, Jasmine looked around for Wells, finding him watching from a distance, a small, satisfied smile on his face. When their eyes met, he raised his glass in a silent toast. Later, as the gathering began to wind down, Jasmine found herself on the balcony, taking a moment alone to process everything that had happened. The night air was cool against her skin, the city spread out below like a carpet of lights. "I thought I might find you out here," Wells said, joining her at the railing. "It can be a bit much, all those musicians in one room." Jasmine smiled. "They're very enthusiastic." "That's one word for it," Wells chuckled. Then, more seriously, "You've impressed a lot of people tonight, Ms. Carter." "Thanks to you," she said, turning to face him, "though I'm still not entirely sure why you did all this." Wells looked out at the city for a long moment. "My mother was a piano teacher," he said finally. "Not a famous one, just a woman who taught neighborhood kids in our living room. She loved music more than anything in the world, but she never had the opportunities to pursue it seriously." He turned back to Jasmine. "When I heard you play last night, I heard what my mother might have become with the right chances. And I behaved exactly like the kind of entitled person she always warned me not to be. So this is about making amends?" Jasmine asked. "Partly," Wells admitted. "But it's also about recognizing something valuable and making sure it doesn't get lost. Your talent, those kids' potential, it matters. It shouldn't depend on luck or privilege whether great music gets heard." Jasmine considered this. "The endowment you announced tonight, was that planned before last night?" "The idea was there," Wells said. "Your playing was the catalyst that turned idea into action." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the city. "I got a call from the symphony today," Jasmine said finally. "They want me to perform next weekend." Wells smiled. "Eleanor works fast. You'll say yes, of course. I'm meeting with them tomorrow to discuss it. And after that?" Victoria seemed quite taken with your playing. So did Richard. Jasmine took a deep breath. "I don't know yet. For so long I've been focused on just getting through each day, taking care of my family. The idea of having choices again is overwhelming." "You don't have to decide everything tonight," Wells said. "But whatever you choose, I hope you'll keep playing. The world needs your music, Ms. Carter." As she looked out at the city that had been her home through hardship and sacrifice, Jasmine felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her. Not just hope, but possibility. For years she'd believed her dreams were behind her, casualties of life's unexpected turns. Now she was beginning to see that perhaps they had just been waiting, like seeds dormant through a long winter, ready to grow again when the season changed. The next morning, Jasmine woke early. For the first time in years, she felt truly rested, as if some long-carried burden had begun to lift. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Blackwood. "Looking forward to seeing you at 10. Maestro is excited to meet you." As Jasmine dressed for her meeting at the Symphony Hall, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked different somehow, standing straighter, eyes brighter. The woman who had served drinks at the Ivory Room was still there. But now there was someone else too, the pianist she'd once been, the musician she might still become. She sat down at her old piano for a few minutes before leaving, running through scales to warm up her fingers. The instrument's slightly uneven tone no longer bothered her as it once had. This piano had sustained her through the darkest times, keeping the music alive inside her even when she couldn't see a way forward. "Thank you," she whispered, touching the worn wood gently before closing the lid. Outside her building, a sleek black car waited. Not a taxi, but a town car with a driver holding a sign with her name. A note was attached, "For your convenience. No strings attached." "I love you," Jasmine smiled and got in. As the car pulled away from the curb, she didn't look back at her apartment building. Instead, she looked forward toward the Symphony Hall rising in the distance, its glass facade catching the morning sun like a promise of brighter days to come.